Good evening and welcome to the February Schuman Talk, where we discuss issues we face in Europe today in the light of Robert Schumann's vision for a community of peoples deeply rooted in Christian values. And we send these talks out each month on the 9th of the month at 6 p.m. to remember that on May the 9th, 1950, the French Foreign Minister Robert Schuman gave a 3-minute speech in which he laid the foundation for the European house, where today 450 million Europeans live together in peace. Now, I call that the defining moment of post-war Europe, because in this 3-minute speech, less time than it takes to boil an egg or make a cup of coffee, Robert Schuman launched the European movement for peace and unity that has led to today's European Union. And this was a movement that was rooted in Christian forgiveness and reconciliation with former enemies. And our guest today is an author who addresses the problem facing us today of loving those perceived as enemies. Our guest is Dr. Matthew Kaemingk. He has a Dutch surname, but several generations back, he's the son of migrants, the descendant of migrants from Holland, lives today in America. And this is a book he's written called Christian Hospitality and Muslim Immigration in an Age of Fear. Now, this is not a brand new book. It came out in 2018, I believe it was. And I'm very grateful to Matthew for writing this book. It actually uses as a case study Amsterdam and the Netherlands. And we'll discover why as we get into this. So welcome, Matthew, to this month's Schuman Talk. We're really glad to have you with us.
Oh, thank you so much. It's great to be here. I'm looking forward to jumping into this conversation.
Let me say how very grateful I am that you've written this book. It fills a real gap, and as I hope our listeners are also going to hear, you are addressing a very real problem and coming up with some very real responses, drawing on the work of Abraham Kuyper, whom we've often mentioned in Schuman Talks in the past, but we'll introduce him again to our listeners in a little bit. So, tell me, what is the situation you are addressing? We've recently seen the inauguration of the new president of America. We're facing many situations in Europe that represent a great polarization in society. Sketch the background that you're speaking to, the context in which you are bringing up the subject of Christian hospitality.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, throughout Western democracies right now, Western democracies have been dealing with globalization and immigration for many years. And globalization and immigration puts a variety of pressures and a variety of questions to Western democracy about how we navigate deep cultural, religious, and political difference. And as Westerners, really as human beings, when we encounter difference, we tend to engage in a sort of fight or flight mentality, politically speaking. And I'm very interested in how democracies develop systems and patterns of resilience. How do they endure and even thrive through engaging immigration and deep difference? And as a political ethicist and a political theologian, as a Christian myself, I want to ask questions of how do Christian citizens engage issues of deep difference in politics. And so when I was thinking about those kinds of things, I wanted to pick a very specific issue and a very specific place to tackle those questions of deep difference and sort of look at how Western democracy might handle that. I came across a book called Murder in Amsterdam uh, in
Ian
which,
Baruma.
yeah, by Ian Baruma, in which it tells sort of the thrilling, tragic, and awful story of Theo van Gogh, his murder by a Muslim immigrant in the Netherlands, and the ways in which the Netherlands and Dutch citizens responded to that murder and responded to to Muslim immigrants in the Netherlands. You know, I live in America, and we tend to see the Netherlands as a place of profound tolerance. The Netherlands as this welcoming and progressive nation that welcomes everyone and has no rules, you know, with marijuana and prostitution and all those sorts of things. Um, and yet, reading that book, Murder in Amsterdam, it was stunning to watch a country that I had considered very, very tolerant become quite angry and hostile towards Muslim immigration. And so that book and that particular instance in question of how do you respond to Muslim immigration as a Christian, that really grabbed my attention and really sort of drove my research moving forward.
Now, you have actually spent quite a considerable time in Amsterdam, studying at the Free University here for a year, and other institutions in Holland as well. So it's not just something that you've researched from a distance. You've done a lot of interviews with people in Holland as well. And of course, I'm very interested in the fact that you have done it in Amsterdam, but this is of interest actually to people everywhere,
Mm.
because as you say, this is your case study to draw out principles that can be applied everywhere. Now, it might seem like we have no rules and laws for concerning prostitution and marijuana. There are, but indeed, Holland, Amsterdam has it reputation being the most liberal city in the world. Indeed.
Yeah.
So, yeah, um, you talk at one stage about the four horsemen of muscular liberalism in the Netherlands. You talk about Pim Fortuyn, you talk about Ayaan Hirsi Ali, Theo van Gogh, and Geert Wilders. These are all household names in the Netherlands. Um, you, you're talking now about these liberals who then become very intolerant of something. How did
Yeah.
each of them demonize Islam?
Yes, yeah, right. So, in response to, decades of permissive immigration and multiculturalism in the Netherlands, after 9/11, you have this rise of right-wing nationalists, right-wing populists who dramatically criticize Muslims and Muslim immigration policies in the Netherlands. And each one of them kind of, there's commonalities between these four nationalists, these four sort of anti-Muslim voices, but they each have their own unique little twist or their own unique way in which they demonize Muslims or marginalize them. So for Pim Fortuyn, famously a homosexual man, he would particularly use his gay identity as a sort of foil against Muslims. So if Muslims are allowed to emigrate to the Netherlands, then I am in danger. That this is a sexually repressive and violent religion, and so it needs to be excluded. Whereas Ayaan Hirsi Ali would, at the time, was an atheist. I believe she's converted to Christianity now, but she would use her atheism and her sort of marriage to the Enlightenment and reason to say that Islam is a backwards religion that is irrational and illogical and illiberal. That it is, it's sort of medieval, and so we in Europe are enlightened and we are modern, and so we can't go back to that. Geert Wilders would really sort of roll in on the national identity, that we need to have a strong national identity and that this is a foreign element. And then Theo van Gogh would do all these things, but he would also, as an artist and a provocateur, he would sort of mock Islam and, with cynicism and humor, basically say Muslims are incapable of humor. They're incapable of fun. They're incapable of sarcasm, and so there's sort of an othering of them in that way. But while these are diverse ways to do this, ultimately the goal of each one of them is to say Muslims can never be Dutch. Muslims cannot be Dutch, and we either need to exclude or assimilate them. There is no way for a Muslim person to actually be Dutch.
So what you're saying is that each one of these people at that time embraced so-called liberal tolerance, and yet we saw the intolerance of liberal tolerance coming out. Can you talk a bit more about the dominant role, the hegemony, as you write about it in your book, of liberalism on our society, not just in the Netherlands, but generally in the West?
Sure. So it's sort of there's a belief within secular Europe that it has transcended religion, that it has matured beyond religion, that it has emerged from sort of the darkness of faith into the enlightenment of secularism. And so the only way to truly join Europe is to go through a secularizing process. So you have to outgrow your religion in order to be a true European. And so both Muslims and Christians and Jews have to navigate this sort of unwritten rule, largely, that in order to be truly free, you must break all bonds with one's faith. Or your faith simply needs to be sort of privatized or relativized in some certain way for you to join civilized society. And so this is sort of the tragic irony of illiberal liberalism, right? Is that you're not actually free to be yourself. You are freed to be liberal.
Yeah. So there's a sleight of hand here. Liberalism is talking about you religious people, you believers, you've got to be pushed over into the private realm. You're not allowed to bring your faith into the public square. And yet, liberalism is a faith. It ascribes a certain package of beliefs, particularly in the supremacy of human reason. And it is demanding that it's the only faith that can be in the public square. Everything else has to be pushed to the side.
Yeah, that's right. So like a quick little fun example that I like to use is, when a Muslim woman wears the hijab and is asked, why do you wear the hijab? She does not say, I do this.
That's the head covering.
Yeah, the head covering. She does not say, I wear this in submission to Allah, or I wear this because of God's command. She will say, well, this headscarf is my personal expression of my personal beliefs. Even though that's not the true reason why she wears it. But in a liberal society, she has been taught that she has to talk in terms of personal expression and not submission and obedience to God. So in all these subtle little ways, secular liberal society disciplines religious people into taking on its language.
So when the liberal says, no, if you want to be European, you have to accept these European values, and you need to respond to that and say, those are not European values, those are the values of European liberals. But there are also European Catholics and European Protestants and European Jews and European Muslims, and those are not the same values. where did this arrogance come from to say you're claiming the whole ball of wax as European values?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's obviously sort of this legacy of European colonialism that sort of sees Europe as the center of the world, as sort of the vanguard of humanity.
Mm-hmm.
And Europeans, can imagine that it's their job to lead and liberate the rest of humanity. And so that colonial legacy, when you marry it with secularism, is basically our job is to liberate religiously backwards people. And you can see this very clearly in the French school debates over the headscarves of we need to force Muslim girls to take off their headscarves so that we can liberate them from their religion and liberate them from Muslim men. And so we have to force them to be free, essentially. Yeah.
Yeah. You use the phrase, I think it comes from Francis Fukuyama, the end of history, to express that the sense that liberalism has led us now to the final point. We've reached the acme of history. That is now being very much challenged on all sorts of sides, isn't it? Liberalism is being seen to be the illegitimate offspring, actually, from its Christian foreparents, if you like.
Yeah. So in the book, I talk about like three basic mistakes that liberals make when it comes to thinking about faith. They forget that faith is pervasive, it's public, and it's pluriform. So faith is pervasive in that everyone has a faith, including them. Faith is pluriform in that we don't agree on our faiths. We have diverse faiths, and those disagreements aren't going to go anywhere. There's no way to overcome them and sort of unify all humanity. And then the last one is that faith is public, which is that there's no way to privatize your faith. It will constantly be coming out. And these three fundamental mistakes or misunderstandings about how faith works really do inhibit liberals from understanding how to navigate a pluralistic society or how to govern a pluralistic society, right? Because when liberals govern a religiously diverse society, they tend to think, well, let's just get these religious people to privatize their faith, or let's just get them to assimilate to what we want, or or they imagine that they don't have any values that they bring to politics, that they don't bring any bias to the politics, that they can sort of do it in a purely secular or rational way, and that really inhibits them.
Yeah. So you set in your book, this is the problem, this is the backdrop, and then you begin to talk about somebody who wrote more than 100 years ago as giving an answer to our situation today. And you're talking about Abraham Kuyper, who was many things. Perhaps a public theologian is the most
Sure.
overall description, but he was journalist, he was a theologian, he was a domine, he was a politician, he became the prime minister, he was an educationalist. And we'll probably talk about some of the things that he did, and we have in the past on this program as well. He died over 100 years ago, and he has been very influential in my own thinking, but many people have told me, well, he's passé, he's irrelevant, why don't you choose somebody who's up to date? Now, so why do you think he's got something relevant to say in our situation on both sides of the Atlantic?
Yeah, that's great. Well, I certainly don't think Kuyper is always right, and I certainly don't think he can solve all of our issues. But I do think on this question of deep difference, he's incredibly helpful, that he does offer a number of concepts that are particularly helpful for Christians. So, what I just talked about in terms of faith being public and pluriform and pervasive, that's something that he was arguing like 150 years ago. In many ways, Kuyper was a man before his time in thinking about how do we deal with deep religious and philosophical differences. And I think what's special about him is the context within which he was working. So the Netherlands at the time was deeply divided when he was a politician. It was divided into four groups. You had Catholics and Protestants, but you also had socialists and liberals. And these four groups, none of them was powerful enough to dominate the nation. And so they had to find some way to work together. And they had to find some way to divide and share power, even though they were pulling the nation in different directions, right? The socialists wanted to lead the Netherlands into socialism, just like the Catholics wanted to lead it into Catholicism. And many of the Protestants wanted to make it, a Protestant nation and to sort of rule over all of the other ideologies and worldviews.
Particularly the Calvinists.
Yeah, the Calvinists, right? So what's unique about Kuyper is he sees this ideological diversity and he says we should not opt for hegemony to try to dominate and crush. Instead, we should try to create a just society in which diverse ways of life can flourish and compete with one another. So he wasn't sort of romantic. He very much disagreed with the socialists and the Catholics and the liberals. Strongly disagreed with them. He didn't want to hold their hand and give them a hug, right? But he wanted there to be a real debate. He wanted there to be a fight, but he wanted it to be a fair fight. And so that kind of sets him apart from, the nationalists on one side, the right-wing nationalism on one side, but it also sets him apart from a sort of left-wing multiculturalism as well. So I think what's special about him is Kuyper provides us with a fundamentally different way of engaging deep difference that avoids right-wing nationalism on one side and a sort of left-wing multiculturalism on the other side. And that's ultimately why I find him useful. Though even in the book, I talk about ways he's very imperfect as well.
Yeah, so you're the way you describe it in the book is you're offering a third way to the left-wing multiculturalism and the right-wing nationalism. And I think one of the things that's very helpful for me was your description of let's take Amsterdam's history. You had a phase where the Catholic Church was dominant and nothing else was allowed. The Anabaptists were not tolerated. Then we moved into the Calvinistic period where even other Protestants had to worship behind facades, what was called schuilkerken, hidden churches, clandestine churches. And that was true for the Lutherans. That was true for the Remonstranten. That was true for the Anabaptists. And so Calvinism really dominated. And then you identified this period of time, like from the 1900s to the 1960s, where there were these roughly four equal streams in society, and this was strongly influenced by Kuyper when he was prime minister, to allow a social pluralism to emerge. And we're actually we've started 750-year celebration of the city, and we're looking for ways to help people understand how faith has shaped the city through each of the centuries. And so that was a particular useful insight that I think we're building into some of the celebrations that we have in mind. Now, what was Kuyper's vision then for Christian pluralism? In this term verzeiling or pillarization is fallen into disrepute in Holland. And if anybody hears you talking about pluralism, they think you're saying, well, we've got to go back to the time of the verzeiling, which took on ridiculous overtones at times. I mean, my father-in-law was actually the president of a Protestant goat breeding club. And I said to my wife, he didn't even have any goats. Why was he president of Protestant goat breeding club? She said, because he was Protestant.
That's great. Well, I think what I would say is much of that developed, that sort of pillarization in which, the Christians have their own schools and clubs and newspapers, and then the liberals have their own schools and clubs and newspapers, and the socialists have theirs. That largely developed after Kuyper, in that I don't think Kuyper had quite that level of deep division in mind. But I think what I would say is, deep within the project of modernity, is a dream of a united and uniform nation in which everyone is liberal. There's sort of a longing for all of European citizens to assimilate to a sort of singular, secular, liberal market economy of consumption. And when Muslims refuse to join that, when Christians refuse to join that, when Jews go off in their little corners and refuse to assimilate to that, I think that makes liberals uncomfortable, and I think it makes them disappointed and frustrated and angry, because secular liberalism longs for a sort of liberal uniformity. And so I think that it's a good thing, for us to have, Christian clubs and Muslim soccer teams and, Jewish cooking groups or whatever, because we are people of faith and we are communal. So coming together in those communities is fundamentally a good and lovely thing. And yeah, so I think that's what I would say. Maybe a little bit more versiling would be a lovely thing.
So it's the living in bubbles that you said that developed really after Cowper's time, but Cowper himself did lay the foundation, insisting that the newspapers and clubs and trade unions and so on could be organized along the streams of these different worldviews. But his intention was not that they should be living in silos with no contact with each other, even within the Protestant area. If you were Dutch Reformed, you didn't go to the re-Reformed greengrocer. They really did start living in bubbles.
Yeah. So I think it's a sort of grabbing one part of Kuyper's thought, because there's other parts of his thought that really argues that Christians need to go out into the world and engage. So I don't see his theology as arguing to run away from the culture, but to engage in it.
So let's go back to the core of his vision of pluralism. Expand that a bit more. How is that a real option for us today?
Yeah. So I've talked a little bit of his deconstruction of why uniformity and hegemony and assimilation are bad ideas. But how do we live amidst this deep difference? I think one, if we can talk just a little bit of theology for a moment, as a theologian, is his doctrine of common grace, which is this belief that God is active in the world, outside of the church, and that God is blessing people outside of the church with wisdom and virtue and goodness. And so this, I would argue, is a very important doctrine for Christians who are in favor of democracy and religious freedom. Because if you believe that Christians are the only ones with any goodness, virtue, truth, or wisdom, then it's not very hard to get to the point of, well, Christians should be in charge of everything. And Christians always know what is right. And Christians always know what is just. And non-Christian citizens are nothing but a threat to political justice and freedom and so forth. However, Kuyper's vision of common grace would argue that when Muslims and Buddhists and atheists and so forth get involved in political life, they might have something good to offer. And there might be something we can learn from them, and they might have something to teach us. So, this doctrine of common grace that he offers to his followers is it helps with a certain Calvinism that would see the whole world as sinful and depraved, and we're the only ones who are good and right and true. When you believe God's active, that changes your political posture towards those that you disagree with.
When you believe God is active outside of the church as well. Yes. Yes. So, what do you see Christians are doing wrong, getting wrong about wanting to take back their nation for God? And of course, this is highly topical, not only in America, in your country, but here we see people like Putin, Nigel Farage, Viktor Orban, Geert Wilders, you've mentioned. They are all making some kind of claims about defending Judaic Christianity. What are they doing wrong?
Yeah, so this leads us to one other really important doctrine, political doctrine that Kuyper focuses on, which is that Jesus Christ is king. Christ is king, not Christians. And that distinction is critically important for him. If Christ is king, then first of all, we can relax because despite all the difference and difficulty we might see all around us, we can rest in Christ's kingship and Christ's sovereignty. So we don't have to grasp for power because Christ has it. The second is slightly more aggressive, which is as Christians, if we try to grasp the throne, if we try to grasp power in that way, in a sort of desperate way, we are disrespecting Christ's power and sovereignty. That we're trying to grasp a throne that doesn't belong to us. And I think that people like Putin and Orban and Geert Wilders are actually quite fragile men. They're quite fragile in that they govern by and through fear. That if I don't grasp this power, this sort of nation will be lost. And Christians who follow them are also kind of being persuaded by the politics of fear. And I would argue that as Christians who believe in Easter, who believe in resurrection, we can't be driven by fear. Our politics has to be driven by faith, hope, and love. And faith, hope, and love, casts out fear. And so I would say that is a central political question for Christians in Europe and for Christians here in America, who all too often are being driven by the politics of fear rather than the politics of faith, hope, and love.
Well, that brings us to the specific response to Islam, the idea that Islam is coming to take over and therefore it requires a like-minded response. That's obviously not the model of Christ. And you described the responses of three Dutch theologians. Can you unpack their perspectives, their Christological perspectives, as a way of helping guide us as to how we should respond to Islam in our midst?
Yeah, so one is so this Dutch theologian Klaas Schilder, who talks about how Jesus uses power and sort of the creative. He's a very imaginative and sort of dramatic theologian, but he picks up on a number of images in Christ's life that shows a sort of upside down way that Jesus uses power. So, one image that I think is particularly beautiful is in the Garden of Gethsemane on the night Jesus is arrested. You know, the soldiers and priests come with swords and clubs and torches, and it's dark and they're shouting and fighting in fear. Everyone is either fighting or they're fleeing. Um, Sort of classic human responses, right? To fight or flee. Except for one person. One person does something very odd and unexpected. Jesus reaches out his hand, an unarmed hand, and he heals someone. He doesn't heal someone who's on his side. He actually heals someone who's come to attack and arrest him. And Klaus Schilder argues that in this particular moment, the true king of Israel is showing how the kings of Israel should use their power. That you use your power not to dominate, but to heal. Not simply your friends, but also your enemies. And here it's particularly a servant or a slave of the priest. So the kings were meant to heal the oppressed and to liberate them. And so there you get this picture of Christ's love and power. And in a political moment that we are experiencing now, which is shouting and swords and clubs and torches, what would it look like for Christians to reach out an unarmed hand and be ministers of healing and peace? I think that's one invitation. The other invitation comes from Hans Boersma, another Dutch theologian, who talks about the cross itself as a hospitality. Here we have the God of the universe reaching out his arms to a hostile world. And the hospitality that we see in the cross is actually quite different from a left-wing multiculturalism. A left-wing multiculturalism can be sort of romantic about difference. Like, let's let all of these immigrants into our country, and it will be this amazing, diverse, multicolored nirvana of peace and love. Liberal multiculturalism, sort of left-wing multiculturalism, can be very romantic about diversity and deep difference and the possibilities of immigration. It has a hard time telling the truth about the cost of hospitality, the discomfort, the difficulty involved. And for Christians, what we see at the cross and at the Lord's Supper is a costly hospitality, right? That it tells the truth about the pain of love and justice in a dangerous world. So when Christians ponder the cross and the hospitality on the cross, they see something that's costly. And so they go out to love their Muslim neighbors with eyes wide open to the cost and the difficulty of that it's not going to be easy. And,
now you tell the story of Kees Siebrandi, a pastor in Lelystad. Do you remember what you said about him in your book?
Yeah, so Kees, he was an interesting fellow. So when I was doing my research in the Netherlands, I heard about this pastor. He's a Pentecostal pastor, charismatic, and at the time, a bunch of mosques were being burned or they were being defaced in the Netherlands. There was sort of this big wave of backlash against Muslims, and so Kees Siebrandi, he and a number of other charismatic pastors went to these mosques and said to the Muslims, they said, we are going to guard your mosques. We're going to make sure that no one burns your mosques or destroys them. And I was so excited to meet this man because I thought, oh, this is going to be really great. I bet you this pastor just really loves Muslims. I bet you he just thinks Muslims are great. And I go out to his house and sit down and have coffee with him. And, and I'm so excited to ask him, so why did you do this great act of Christian love, for Muslims? And he said, well, I want to be clear with you. I don't like Muslims. He says, I don't like Muslims. I think they've brought a lot of trouble to our country. They cause crime and all of these things. And I was very confused. And then I was like, well, but why did you help these Muslims then if you didn't like them? And he said two things to me. He said, first of all, it is my job to take care of a Jewish cemetery, where Holocaust victims um, were buried. And he said, I don't want to care for another cemetery where Muslims would be buried as victims of violence. But the second thing he said to me was that Jesus calls me to love my neighbors, my enemies too. And so what we see in Jesus is not this romantic lie that everyone is our friend, that everyone is our sort of loving neighbor. And if we just love enough, everything's going to be okay. Jesus believes that enemies exist, right? Jesus believes that deep difference is real, and real debates and battles happen. But he calls us to love across those differences. And that's a kind of politics that is very different from right-wing nationalism and left-wing multiculturalism.
Well, thank you for that very concrete example. Can you give more concrete steps? How do we begin to apply Cowper's vision of a pluralism for our society today? Are there other models you can tell us about?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we've been talking a lot about politics and how we avoid, right-wing nationalism and left-wing multiculturalism. But I think these are things that we can live out in our everyday life, whether we are working in a school or a business, or in our church, or in our families. All of these different institutions are encountering deep difference, right? We are encountering religious, cultural, political, sexual differences in our everyday lives. And as Christians, to be people of both deep Christian conviction and profound Christian civility and hospitality is really important. So I think that's a calling that all of us can live out beyond simply our voting behavior, but being citizens who welcome people with deep cultural and philosophical differences, and demonstrate and practice a sort of Christ-like hospitality. And I use that word practice very intentionally, because when you practice something, you're actually going to be quite bad at it at first. As you try to demonstrate hospitality to people who are very different from you, you're going to make some mistakes. But practicing is something that we do over time, being made into the image of Christ as we sort of try on Jesus, and his methods of using power, which are, if we're honest, his methods of using power are quite different from our own.
Well, thank you, Matthew. Is there anything else you'd like to say to Christians who feel like they want to reclaim our nation for Jesus, our city for Jesus, and feel like the best options available are politicians who are saying we're going to defend our Christian heritage?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say a couple things. One is um, that the church has often been healthiest, strongest, and most vibrant when it is not married to political power. That marrying oneself to political power is a wonderful way to kill the church. Um, and and I would say that rather than living in fear, what I witnessed throughout Europe when it came to the issue of Muslim immigration was Muslim immigration represents a profound opportunity for the church. So it should not be seen as a challenge or a danger, but primarily as a profound opportunity. I mean, the churches that I encountered who learned to demonstrate hospitality to Muslim immigrants, and they did in a wide variety of ways. Those churches experienced profound renewal and restoration, and experienced, a new way of learning to grow in Christ in profound and exciting ways. And I think that the future of the church in Europe is bright if it leans into the love and the sort of adventure of faith and outreach. When I was a kid, I can remember we would send missionaries to the Middle East, and we would pray. I can remember praying as a child that God would open the Middle East so that we could go there and share the gospel with Muslims. And we would all pray as a community, God, please, would you let our missionaries into the Middle East? And God has answered our prayers in a way that we didn't expect, in that he's actually brought them. He's brought Muslims to us and given us this profound gift. And rather than respond with thanks and excitement and enthusiasm, oh my goodness, Muslims are here. Now we can share the gospel and share the love and hospitality of Jesus. We say, God, what have you done? Why are you doing this to us? And we are missing the profound gift and opportunity that is presented to us. So that's what I would say to that.
Thank you, Matthew. I think that's a great way to round off our conversation. There are three particular words that you use again and again in your book: justice, hospitality, and grace. And these seem to be great descriptions of, I think, the Christ-like response to our polarized situation. Thank you very much indeed.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, and I really am grateful to Schuman Talks for cultivating these conversations. These are really important. So thank you to you, Jeff.
Bless you, Matthew.
Bye.
And we're going to hopefully have another Matthew joining us next month. That's Matthew Taylor. And he's going to continue with actually approaching this problem we have in our society right now from a different angle. He's written a book that's recently come out, The Violent Take It by Force, The Threat of Christian Supremacy. And are we really called to take our nation back for God? So it follows on from what Matthew Kaemingk has just been sharing with us, and this is yet to be confirmed, but we hope that we'll have our second Matthew joining us next month. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us this evening.